Hello, welcome to Sacred Cow Barbecue. I'm Patricia Aiken, an average host with exceptional guests. I recently had the pleasure of interviewing the man behind History Reviewed channel, a YouTube channel. Since he's in South Africa, there's an extreme time difference, but we were able to pre-record with only a few difficulties. Here's the interview. I'm so excited to talk with you today, History Reviewed channel. I know we're going to have a real smorgasbord of all the things that we want to talk about. So I don't think this is going to be your last time here at the barbecue. We're going to have you back lots of times because there's so much to talk about. But the first thing I want to do is talk with you about how you woke up to Jewish supremacy. You were very resistant. So welcome to the barbecue, and I'm just going to try to stay out of your way today.
Oh my goodness. Nice to be on your show. Thank you very much, Patricia. Yeah, Jewish supremacy. It was not a thing that I wanted to get into. I've never been against the Jews. And here in southern Africa, the Boers and the Rhodesians, we never regarded Jews as being sub-citizens or anything different. We always looked on these people as white people. We saw Jews as just another kind of white person who has a religion other than Christianity. And we never really had a problem with these people. Whatever they wanted, we pretty much let them do their thing. And my own mother was also pretty pro-Jewish. And even in my own life, by my own growth and so forth, early on in my life, whenever I had a chance to run into Jews, I spoke to them. I knew that there was some sort of bad view of Jews, but when I was younger, I used to say to myself, what harm can come from talking to a Jew? If you talk to people, you will learn something from people. And I had the same attitude to older people as well. I never saw any harm in talking to someone. And now that I'm a lot older, now I see Jews in a whole different light. But the thing that really woke me up was in the beginning when I did my websites, a lot of my supporters tended to be Christians. And these Christians, most of them Boers or American Christians, many of them came to me with this whole business of Jews. And they'd say, well, Jews are not this and Jews are not that, and they are people of the devil. And they'd give me biblical references and so forth, which didn't mean much to me because I'm not really a Christian. I understand Christian values and I was brought up in that environment, but by myself, I'm not really a Christian. I haven't gone to church. I don't really take the Bible as seriously as the others do, but I have had a lot of interest in spiritual matters in the past. My big thing that drove me throughout a lot of my life was a sort of a Buddhism. I was very interested in spirituality, but not Christian spirituality. And to me, Buddhism worked well for me. And I took it very seriously. But the whole Jewish thing started coming to a head on my African Crisis website when many of these Christians started wanting to talk about the Jews. And in the beginning, I entertained them a little bit, but then I saw how this thing became a whole battle just about the Jews. And then I also couldn't see the sense of it. You know, they'd say, well, the Jews own all the banks, and the Jews control this, and the Jews control that. And I couldn't quite see it, and I also couldn't see anything malicious in this whole business. I just said to these people, you are jealous. You're jealous because the Jews are successful. And that was how I spoke to them. Yeah, really. And if I wanted to find out something about Jews, I just went and talked to my Jewish friends. I'd phone them or I'd send them an email and I'd say, hey, some Christian guy says this. What do you say? And the Jew would tell me, and I'd go back and I'd say to them, listen, the Jews say this or that. But then on African Crisis, I was trying to focus on communism and blacks and these racial issues that came out of communism. So to me, I didn't see the link to the Jews. And when the Jewish thing started coming in, I had to fight it. After a while, I had to say to people, stop this, because we're now off topic. You're taking me away from the real issues. The real issues are these communist blacks, they're murdering people and so on, and I don't see how the Jews fit into this. You know, it's funny with the Jews. I keep telling people that Jews are so subtle. They are so subtle, you don't realize what Jews are doing. And for example, I was a guy, I believed I was Mr. Free Speech because I didn't care about political correctness. And I said to people, on my website, you can talk about race. You can say anything you want, and I will defend you. And the next thing I find myself doing is I'm busy censoring people. And I'm busy censoring people whenever they mention the word Jew. So I say, get off, man. Shut up. That's not what this website's about. We're about talking about serious matters. And I found myself actually censoring my own website on this topic of Jews. So yet it was not my intention, but that is where these concepts take you. Without you even thinking, you find yourself doing actually that which works for the Jews. Anyhow, this carried on for years, and I chased people away, and I became very adamant about the whole thing. I banned them, and I said to them outright, if you talk about the Jews, I will ban you, and I won't allow you to put any more comments on my website. I don't want your nonsense. And it was a tough thing, and I did it for many years. I did it for the first 12 years of my website, and it was only later that I started changing. And how it started was when I bought a book published in Britain in 2004. And the book was called The Birth of the Nazis. And I've had so many people bringing up this Jewish issue over the years. But what had happened was I'd become gradually more and more interested in the Germans and in Adolf Hitler. And I began to wonder to myself, I wondered what it was that brought Adolf Hitler to power. How did this guy actually come to power? What caused his politics to flourish? And people were sending me stuff all the time. I had tons of stuff coming at me, and I was ignoring all of it. I was looking at it here and there, and I'd say, this is junk, I'm not interested. And I even said to people, you know, I don't want your German propaganda. That's what I thought it was. I said to them, I don't want your German propaganda. I just want history. All I want is history. I'm just interested in the facts. Stop giving me a whole bunch of stories about the Jews. So I went and I got this book. I found this very nice book called The Birth of the Nazis. And
ooh, sounds ominous.
Well, it's even more. There's even more twists to it. I'll tell you a little bit more. And when I got this thing, The Birth of the Nazis, I looked at it before I bought it, and I saw, it's written by a British historian. Okay, so it's written by an Englishman, so that can't be German propaganda. And then I looked on the back cover and I saw this had just been published in 2004, and all the British newspapers gave this book rave reviews. So I thought, aha, British author, British newspapers give it the thumbs up, this can't be pro-German propaganda. And then there was a funny little section on this book which said, for the first time in 50 years, in English, the story of the Freikorps. I think that's the best way to pronounce it, but it's like the Free Corps. And I thought to myself, this is a little bit weird. For the first time in 50 years in English, you want to tell me that something can be hidden away from English language people for 50 years? Anyhow, the thrust of this book was about this thing called the Freikorps. And the Freikorps was essentially German soldiers from World War I who formed a new army. And this army fought against the communists who were trying to take over Germany. And the thrust of the book is about this thing called the Freikorps. But in order to tell the story, they tell the whole story of the birth of the Nazis. When I read the book, I actually found I wasn't that interested in the Freikorps angle, this thing that had been hidden for 50 years. It had interesting information, yes, but it was not the overriding story. What I was just interested in was the politics and how these things came about. And so when I was reading this book, my one Jewish friend here in Joburg, whom I'd known for well over 20 years, he had a habit of phoning me every day for an hour. We'd talk at least 4 or 5 days a week for an hour. Later on, I began to view this with great suspicion. I began to realize that he's messing with my head. But at the time, I regarded it as a sign of a close friendship, and I didn't suspect anything. And when he phoned me, I told him that, you know what, I've got this book, The Birth of the Nazis, and I'm busy reading it. And this guy was about 20 years older than me, and he loved history. My Jewish pal loved history. He knew history backwards. So you could talk to him about virtually anything in history, and he'd be able to come back at you. And he surprised me many times with things that he came up with. So while I was reading this book, and I read a bit slowly, I'm busy with other things, so I'd say to him, you know, I've read a bit more, and this and that. But as I was reading this book, and I'd gone a couple of chapters into it, one day I was reading and I looked at a name and I said, but you know, this name is not just like accidentally Jewish. This name is definitely Jewish. It can only be a real Jew. And this happened to be a communist in Germany. But as I looked at this name, I thought to myself, but hold on. The name before that was also Jewish. And the name before that was Jewish. And the one before that. And I started going back and looking at the names. And then it hit me like a ton of bricks that 9 out of 10 of the primary communists trying to overthrow Germany, and this, by the way, is before Adolf Hitler. The communists were trying to overthrow Germany at the end of World War I. And 9 out of 10 of these communists were Jews. And they were obviously, blatantly, garishly Jews. And the book wasn't emphasizing that these were Jews, but it came out in the text, and you could also piece it together yourself. You could see some of the names are obviously Jewish. But when I realized that 9 out of 10 of the communists stirring up revolution, inciting Germans to kill Germans, and starting civil wars inside Germany. I mean, Bavaria broke away from Germany and became a communist republic. Germans had artillery and machine guns in the streets. They were killing each other. City after city became communist. And all of this was done by Jews. Jews were leading the communist charge all across Germany. And it took these old soldiers to form a new army and actually shoot these communists out of city after city after city. But it was when the penny dropped and I realized that 9 out of 10 commies in Germany before the Nazis, before Hitler, was a Jew, that blew my mind. And I told my Jewish friend that. The one evening he phoned me, and once I understood this and I looked back and forward through the book and I reread parts of it, and this whole thing now came to my attention, I found myself completely in sympathy with the Germans. I thought, good Lord, these Jews are busy destroying Germany, and the Germans are trying to hold Germany together. And I was so incensed once I understood that the Jews were maliciously destroying Germany. So when my Jewish pal phoned me that evening, I said to him, I now understand why the Germans are angry with the Jews. Those were my exact words to him. He was so infuriated by that. He spoke to me that evening, and then he didn't phone me for another 2 months. And after 2 months, he phoned me, and I didn't give a damn. I thought, to hell with you. And when he phoned me again, we spoke for about another month before I finally told him to bugger off. But in that last month that we spoke, I checked all the different facts with him. I said to him, but you know, that Jewess over there, Rosa Luxemburg, she was doing this and this and that. And my Jewish friend would say, yes, that is true. Everything in the book is true. Everything the Jews know about. The Jews know about all these things. They know about all the crimes they committed in Germany, and they still ignore it. But that was how this thing hit home to me. And once I grasped that this was real, then I began to start digging into this whole Jewish thing. And I can't tell you the psychic shock that I experienced once this came home to me. Once it came home to me that Jews are a real danger in the real world, and that Jews walk around under your nose and interacting with you, and you actually cannot trust these people at all. I must tell you that gave me a real shock. And then I started digging more and more, and from there onwards, that's how my thoughts developed, because I was only interested in Jews from a historical point of view. I don't care about the Jews and the Bible, because I'm not a Christian. So the Christian arguments against the Jews are of no interest to me. But what is of interest to me is the political and historical arguments against these people. And those are the things that really hit me. And I've got to tell you, it's a heck of a thing. Once I started looking at this, it drove me quite crazy, and I started looking more and more. And I looked at everything. Then I started digging into the Holocaust. And I thought to myself, it cannot be that you can say 6 million people died and 6 million people didn't die. I just cannot believe that several governments could come together and say 6 million Jews were murdered and every one of them is lying about it. There's no ways in hell that that could be the case. And true as nuts. Once I started digging into the Holocaust stuff, I was absolutely dumbstruck. I couldn't believe the actual data that was there. And it blew my mind completely. And after that, I just dug and dug and dug and dug in every which way. And everywhere you start looking, you start seeing the fingerprints of the Jews all over history. It's shocking. It becomes truly shocking. So that's how I woke up to the Jews.
And how do they hide this History Reviewed channel? How are the Jews so successful at keeping us from knowing this?
Yeah, I want to get into this in one of my future videos. So I don't want to give everything away that I'm thinking of showing you.
Oh, come on now.
But what I will tell you is that you can read quite a bit of this. You can come across quite a lot of this in a series of videos I've already done called The Great Jewish Mask. And the Great Jewish Mask is basically somebody who's got a good, solid science background, a really excellent science background, wrote a little book in 1936 called The Great Jewish Mask. And it's about how the Jews learned to read and write, and how the Jews started stealing stuff from other civilizations. And it tells you the story of the Jews before the Bible. But it boils down to this person's analysis of the Jews in ancient times is that the Jews became propagandists more than 2,000 years ago. And if you look at the Jews now, you'll see that yes, they are just propagandists. That is what they are. And what was also interesting to me is in the days before I was interested in the Jews, my brother was a soldier in Rhodesia, and he was in the Special Forces in Rhodesia, the SAS. And my brother's a lot older than me, and my brother would often sit with me and he'd tell me things that he'd learned in the army. And he'd say to me, you know what, we had courses and they taught us this. They taught us this about communism. This is how a communist operates. I remember my brother saying to me in the 70s that communists are so subtle that a teacher in a school will be teaching communism and she won't even realize she's teaching communism. So he already prepared me for this insidious way of thinking. But I thought that all of this came from Russia. What I never knew was the Jewish involvement in Russia, that the largest population of Jews in the world was in Russia, and that they were behind the communist revolution in Russia. And that these tricks that the communists in Russia learned are actually Jewish tricks. Lots of these things that we associated later with communism and which made us hate communism so much. We used to say communists are nothing but liars. Well, it turns out Jews are nothing but liars. Jews are even bigger liars than the communists.
Because communism is a Jewish construct.
Exactly. Invented by Jews, promoted by Jews, and even the Jews that you think should be against it are actually secretly assisting it. In fact, that same Jewish friend of mine, I must tell you, that same Jewish friend of mine later told me that he'd met Nelson Mandela in person. And I know another guy who's a half Jew who also met Nelson Mandela in person. When the Jew and the half Jew start talking about Nelson Mandela, you'd think that they have just met God himself. They fawn over this communist black piece of garbage called Nelson Mandela.
Well, we call him Saint Nelson here, History Review Channel.
Yes, okay. I'm telling you, you must listen to them talk endlessly, and I would eventually have to shut them up because I can't take this anymore. They go on and on and on about him and how great he is and this and how they were awed by it, and it's exactly that same concept is reflected in the mass media. It's the Jewish mass media that turned him into Saint Nelson Mandela. It's a Jewish thing. The Jews love him, and I think they loved him because he was killing whites. I think so.
Well, that's what they hid his communism for a long time. But when he was when he was imprisoned on Robben Island, he wrote How to Be a Good Communist. He was trained in Russia.
I think a correction is he wrote How to Be a Good Communist. That he wrote before his trial.
Oh.
It was used in his trial, and apparently it was a 90-page document in his own handwriting. And they said to him, so why did you write this? And he came up with various excuses. But if you know a bit more about Nelson Mandela, on YouTube they've got a little piece from his trial, from the opening of his trial. I still want to go and pull it out because within the first minute he's already lying to you. But Nelson Mandela wrote How to Be a Good Communist, yeah, and that was evidence against him. But there was stacks of evidence against him, stacks and stacks and stacks. They arrested tons of Jews with him in that Rivonia, in that house in Rivonia.
Right, exactly. And so I look at the destruction of South Africa as being Jewish, as the rest of the destruction of European nations are, European American destruction, everything. I see it all as a Jewish construct. And so what gives me hope about you, History Review Channel, is that you didn't see it. Because I have so many friends now that I would say, Patricia, why you always bring this out back to the Jews? Why is it always about the Jews? And it's so hard to explain it to people, but you, after 12 years, woke up, and even a longer time, so you give me hope, and I'm so happy that you were able to explain your path here, because maybe some other people can hear it now as well.
Well, that is part of my purpose, is to explain why I also missed it, and why so many white people don't get it. The Christians can get it because the Christians come from a biblical angle. So they've got a more contained space within which to operate. And within that, if they read certain parts of the Bible and they put two and two together, then they arrive at that conclusion. But other people have a harder time arriving at it.
Well, I think Christians have a harder time because the church has been so infiltrated, the seminaries and stuff, by this Jewish mindset, that Jews are God's chosen people and they're the people of the Old Testament and stuff. And I know you have a friend that thinks like I do, so we won't get off on this tangent today. But they're, to me, just as hard to wake up. And
Yes.
it's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. So talk to me for just a minute about what it was like growing up in Rhodesia.
In Rhodesia, interesting. When I visited America in 2010, I had wondered what it would be like going to America, and you'll see how this ties back to Rhodesia. So I thought to myself, when I get to America, I'm going to find a whole bunch of uncouth children, and they're going to be rude and nasty and all that kind of thing. Because this was the view that I picked up of what America was like. And when I went to America, I went to visit a friend in Oregon. And I was walking around Portland. And when I was in Portland and I walked into a bank, and everybody had a suit and a tie, and the people were well dressed. Here in South Africa, people walk around in jeans and stuff in the banks and so forth. It's not European anymore. And when I walked around, I suddenly felt so different, and it made me think of Rhodesia. And I said to my friends, you know what? America makes me think of Rhodesia, except America's got computers and cell phones. But otherwise, it reminds me of Rhodesia. And the more I met Americans, I found them to be much more pleasant. I found them much nicer than I expected them to be. And I found them to have manners. In fact, I was the guy who didn't have manners. And later on, I actually felt very bad about myself. I thought, I really behaved, I really behaved almost like a nigger out of Africa. Really, when I look back on my own behavior in America, I thought to myself, these are actually really nice people. And I enjoyed America. Going back to Rhodesia, I remember the biggest thing that I remember about Rhodesia, which I think most whites in the world have forgotten, is a sense of unity and a sense of sticking together and optimism. And people got things done. And even when things went wrong, people kept trying. And the other thing that I remember, that whole spirit of Rhodesia is something I wish I could recapture. I miss it the most, because I don't think people know what it's like to live in a country, especially where you even trust your leader. And
yeah, that's an amazing thing. When people don't have that jaundiced eye about leadership that would be an amazing thing, to get behind someone and really believe in them and have them act in their people's best interest.
Now you're talking, because I haven't seen this ever again. And in Rhodesia, we had the war, we had bad news, and there they didn't censor the news. Every day you'd hear, well, this attack took place, those people were killed there, that happened, the army killed so many terrorists, and so it would go on day in and day out. So you had news coming through all the time. And then when Ian Smith, the Prime Minister, would make a speech, then everybody would know, tomorrow night, the Prime Minister's going to speak. We better be there. We've got to listen. We want to hear our leader speak. And people would be feeling panicky, and people would be feeling uncomfortable. And then he'd come on TV, and he'd give us an update, and he'd tell us, this is the situation, that's the situation. And we'd feel a whole lot better, and morale would be better, and so forth. And that is how I remember Rhodesia. I remember it as vibrant. I remember whites as positive. I remember a sense of unity that I've never experienced since. But when I speak to Americans, the older Americans, I can see that it used to exist in America. Maybe about 50 years ago, it used to exist. It doesn't exist anymore, but it used to exist.
I can't think of an American leader that hasn't been somewhat of a fraud. Really, well, I can't. In the last instance, Eisenhower, of course,
maybe Kennedy.
Kennedy, they had their problems, but I think they were probably closer to that but you see what happened to him. And so,
Absolutely.
Ian Smith, tell me a little more about Ian Smith, if you would, because I know he was a fighter pilot. I know he must have loved Rhodesia. Must have. Tell me more about him.
Okay. Ian Smith. Ian Smith's original claim to fame was that he'd been a fighter pilot in World War II. He'd been shot down as well, and I think captured, and I'm not sure if he escaped as well. But anyhow, he was actually a farmer in Rhodesia, and he seems to have risen in politics quite late. He'd not been in politics all that long, and he was something of an unknown character. And he arose just a couple of years before he declared UDI. And the guy he was up against was a guy by the name of Walensky. They might pronounce it also Walensky. But Walensky was a half Boer, half Jew.
Oh my goodness.
And yes, there's actually quite a funny story. This Walensky guy was a sort of a liberal, and he ruled Rhodesia for a time before Ian Smith. In fact, they tried a funny thing as part of all the funny tricks that they tried before breaking away from Britain. They tried to bring the nations together, and for a short while, the countries now known as Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Malawi were formed into a much bigger country, a country perhaps almost as big as South Africa. And it was called the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland. And it was ruled and run from Salisbury, the capital of Rhodesia. But the blacks at that point already wanted to break away. They were under communist influence, and the blacks broke away, and Malawi became independent and Zambia became independent. So the federation didn't last long. I think they said it lasted something like 4,000 days. I think it was 8 years or something like that. But the federation didn't last long, and then once it broke up, it was back to Rhodesia again. Now, from what I picked up, the Jews wanted to get this Roy Walensky to stand up against Ian Smith, and they were trying that sort of move. There were others who were more moderate than Ian Smith, and those who lived at the time tell me it was very much a touch and go sort of situation. There were many who didn't want to rebel against England, so it was very much a borderline thing. But Ian Smith seems to have been the real driving force in this. And there is something else I want to make a point about Rhodesia and Ian Smith, because it may help to explain why it was that Rhodesia ended up doing what it did. Rhodesia was just another colony, and it wasn't as powerful as South Africa. South Africa was the real powerhouse, and the Jews were here in South Africa in large number. Whereas there were Jews in Rhodesia, but there were only a couple of thousand. I don't think they amounted to more than a few tens of thousands at the most. But the main thing is that the Jews in South Africa had tremendous power, and the Jews in Rhodesia were not that powerful. And Rhodesia itself was not that powerful. And I think this is why Rhodesia slipped through the noose. Because nobody expected this country to really stand up or be anything that would be problematic, nobody spent much time bothering to infiltrate Rhodesia and take over its politics, because it was seen as being just another British colonial country, and it would easily be taken care of. Whereas South Africa was seen as a powerhouse, and everybody with an interest was making sure that they had fingers in South Africa's pie. Whereas Rhodesia was pretty much left alone. It was just a colonial country with a bunch of white farmers in it. And I don't think anybody truly expected Rhodesia to become the radical place that it became. And that is why Rhodesia's politics, I think, was largely uninfiltrated, because nobody really expected there to be any trouble. Whereas South Africa was different, and the Boers had lots of political problems, all coming from these Jews, these English, these liberals. They got it in the neck big time. So those are my thoughts on that.
Well, that's fascinating. When you say the Jews and the English, I mean, it seems to be there seem to be inseparable in the story of South Africa, in the story of Rhodesia later. I mean,
Actually, you're right. You're right. Because, and this was something I only discovered later myself. And it's something that I still want to do another video on because an Englishman called Arnold Lees wrote about it. He wrote an article called Our Jewish Aristocracy about all the Jews in England. And Adolf Hitler was actually very familiar with this. And he referred to England as a Jew-ridden country. He knew that the Jews had infiltrated England from top to bottom. And you're quite right. In South Africa, the Jews and the English are almost inseparable. And the English attitude towards the Boers is the same attitude the British have. The two are inseparable, and the two have worked for the downfall of the Boer time and time again. They not only took the Boers down in the Boer War, where they came and invaded the Boers didn't do anything to them. All that had happened was gold and diamonds had been discovered here, yet they found excuses to come and invade their countries and take it over. And later, and interestingly enough, after the Boers were defeated, the Boers tried to regain power in South Africa. And they did so on the basis of going after the white vote, because the country still had an only white electorate. But what happened was the English were trying to woo the Boers to being loyal to England. And the Boers ended up fighting for England in World War I and World War II. So there was some of these Boers who believed that if they worked with the English, that, you know, things would go better, then they wouldn't have these problems with the English. Little did they realize how these same English would backstab them after they had helped them in 2 world wars. And of course, with Jews, backstabbing is the game. And a lot of what we associate with England, I actually see as part of the Jewish modus operandi. The English became, call it Jewified, and the behavior of England was actually Jewish. And you can say that of the English to this day.
absolutely. Absolutely. When I first heard the Boer War story, I said, wow, that goes back to London real fast. That has to be.
Absolutely.
And, you know, Jews have been involved in England since 1066. They financed that. They've been financing wars. They put Cromwell in power when he let him back in. They've been thrown out, and English flourished without them, but then Cromwell let him back in, that murderous thug.
Yes.
And here's the thing,
Yes.
how is it that Jews are so good at finding sociopathic non-Jews to bring into their wake?
You know, that's an interesting thing. There used to be a guy in South Africa who ran a website called Adolf the Great. It's
Oh,
not
I
online
love.
at the moment.
That's where I got my initial. You can get it in the Wayback Machine, because I go back to that. I didn't realize that came
Okay.
from a South African. That was a wonderful website. That's where I got my first education about Adolf the Great.
Okay, well, the guy who runs it is an English-speaking South African. Now, that guy and I had a lot of discussions the one day about the IQ of the Jews. And he told me that he'd come to the conclusion that the Jews have a very high verbal IQ. And I've come across this again. The Jews are actually so slick. With the Jews, it's all about words. It's all about the written word. It's all about the spoken word. Jews have made this their science. And anything to do with the Jews, you've got to go back to words. And this is also part of why they have their business success and all that, and how they move around. They know what to say and how to say it and all that kind of stuff. I found that you'll see Jews just love the media. Even though Jews aren't always that entertaining as writers, really, I don't think their ideas are that good. But the one thing Jews know how to do is they know how to write sort of advertising copy, and Jews can everything Jews do, whether it's political or whatever. It is basically like writing advertising copy. They're just busy marketing, and they also are subtle in creating myths, feeding myths, and knowing how to work people between these things. They know that people operate on what they either think is fact or what they believe is fact. And that is, for Jews, it's all about words. Everything's about words, and it's a topic we'll come back to.
Okay. Well, I couldn't agree more. Well, let's do a little promotion here and let people know that they're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. This is Sacred Cow Barbecue. I'm your host, Patricia Aiken, and I'm delighted to have History Review Channel here with me today. And History Review Channel, you also have some great websites, so why don't you let people know what those are, because I know they're going to want to have a look at them. But before you do that, I have to say, run over to freedomslips.com, make a donation there. Freedom isn't free. Help keep us on the air. We have very little censorship around here. We have a little, but not as much as the other places. So go over there and make a donation if you would. We'd appreciate it. So History Review Channel, where can people see more of your work?
My three websites are historyreview.info, africancrisis.org, americancrisis.us. Yes, I'll tell you, the way that we ended up coming to South Africa was pretty much unplanned. It was because things went completely left. Basically, the end of Rhodesia is a complicated story, and it boils down to Henry Kissinger coming and visiting Ian Smith and basically telling him, you have no hope, you must only do one man, one vote. It seems to me that Henry Kissinger very successfully conned Ian Smith. Ian Smith never actually believed in maliciousness of Henry Kissinger. And it's something I've discussed with a certain army colonel that I know who was a close friend of Ian Smith. And I've said to him, didn't they ever suspect that Henry Kissinger was playing them? And he said no, that Ian Smith had no hard feelings towards Henry Kissinger, and that he truly believed Henry Kissinger could not help us. Well, that is all part of the slick Jewish talk, The Jews have got a couple of mechanisms. The most important is, of course, their speaking and writing, because they're messing with your head. But it does help. They know how to play some other games as well, including bribery and those things. Though there is a guy in America, his name is Campbell, and he claims Rhodesia was sold out by Ian Smith, but I don't know of any Rhodesian who believes that, and I certainly don't. But I will go and investigate that more. I will dig more into that, because what Campbell has said, I want to take that up with other people who know Ian Smith better. But yeah, basically the beginning of the end was Kissinger coming and telling us that we've got to make a plan, and British and Americans jointly pushing us towards surrender. And then what they also did was they started putting pressure on the Boers. So they used the Boers because they knew that the Boers of South Africa were the main ones giving us support. So they put pressure on the Boers, and the Boers sometimes cut off our fuel, sometimes cut off our ammunition. And sometimes we only had so many days worth of petrol or so much ammunition left, and we were really pushed and stressed. So there was this push from 1976 onwards. And the way that Rhodesia ended was the whites eventually decided to try and have some proper free and fair elections for blacks. And the South Africans also came to try and help. And we had some internal elections which excluded the communists. And a black guy by the name of Bishop Abel Muzorewa became the prime minister of what was called Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. But this guy, I will still tell other stories about this guy, because this is an example of whites handing over to a black let's call him liberal slash Christian, and he turns out to be a spineless weakling baby. He's completely useless. No Rhodesian will tell you this, but I have since made many discoveries, including speaking to P.W. Botha himself, who was the last president of South Africa.
Oh my gosh, you actually know
loyal.
him. Amazing.
And I'll tell you some more things about this idiot called Muzorewa. So Muzorewa had a running, functioning country. The army was still in place. The whites were still in place. The whites were fighting like crazy to keep the communists off. In fact, some of the most hectic fighting took place at the time when it was Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, and we were doing very well. But this complete idiot and numbskull then handed over the country and agreed to an election which included the communists. And the way Mugabe came to power was he basically sent out his terrorists to all the villages, and he said to the blacks that there will be no end to this war if he doesn't win. And Mugabe's troops also didn't hand in their rifles, because that was part of the deal, was all the different armed groups had to go into various bases and all sit there under British supervision, and there was to be no intimidation. But Mugabe sent some old men and boys, and they went and pretended to be his army, while his real army stayed in the bush, and the blacks knew that the war would continue. And he was the most ruthless of the lot. So when they had elections, Mugabe won by a landslide, but then our commanding officer, General Peter Walls, he even went and spoke to Margaret Thatcher and said to her, you can't let this be. This is not a true, free and fair election. And Margaret Thatcher is also, in my view, yet another sellout. To me, she's also a Jew-ridden conservative, one of these conservatives who's conservative only to a certain degree. The modern term of conservative, I think, applies very well to Margaret Thatcher. And so Margaret Thatcher took us and sold us completely down the river. So we weren't sold down a river by a liberal or Labour commie Englishman. We were sold down the river by a supposed conservative Englishman. And that was pretty much the end of it. So when this
pay attention, America.
Yeah. You know what? The craziest people in America currently are the GOP. And they are behaving in so many ways like the Boers in their final days. I'm warning you, these people are nuts. And these people, I'm watching what the GOP is saying, and they are so Looney Tune at the moment. I think that the GOP may yet hand over America to a bunch of commies. They are absolutely nuts.
Well, you know, there's no difference. I mean, Democrat, Republican, it's just two sides of the same bird. It's a Hegelian dialect. There's no real difference. One is taking us to hell at 95 miles an hour, and the other at 97 miles an hour. There's no real difference.
Exactly. And the one will do it via this angle, and the other one will do it via another angle.
Yeah, and I just have to say, when people are saying, oh, you know, vote for this, it's like saying, oh yeah, we've got Jeff Gordon and Kyle Busch are going to drive for us. It's like it's a NASCAR race. They're going to drive for us. Yeah, well, let's take a look at the car. The car has no engine, no transmission, no radiator. Doesn't matter who you put in the car. The car is completely broken and isn't going to run.
I'm with you. I totally agree. These guys, you know what? There's a whole filtering system. I was thinking about this yesterday. You know, we whites, when we invent a filter, you maybe have dirty water going through a filter, and we filter out so that only the clean water goes through the filter. But the Jews have invented a filter, a Jewish filter, and when you put dirty water through it, only the dirtiest water goes through. It keeps the clean water back. And that's how politics works.
Oh.
Politics is finding the lowest scum and then promoting them. And you find the guy who's the most useless, spineless, most easy to control. And by the way, I think that you'll find that's why a lot of gays and pedophiles and those kinds of weird people are in politics. You know, Obama's also like a bit of a gay and all that.
Just a bit?
Well, I'm being nice to him. and they filter out. I believe that the good people are filtered out.
Yes.
I don't for 1 second, not for 1 second, do I believe that the top politicians in America or Congress or the Senate in any way, shape and form represents the best of America. I don't believe that for 1 second. Not for 1 second. The best are filtered out at a low level.
That's right.
They'll kick out long before they rise.
Exactly. And we're infested with lawyers.
Yeah.
And you want to talk about the word arts and wordsmithing.
Yes.
And spells.
Yeah. And look at how they take the law and pervert it into something absolutely insane. Somebody, you know, the law is not even the law. It's not even fair.
No.
And you know what? We have the same thing in South Africa. The law is completely nuts. It makes no sense at all. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Jews have helped to ensure that there's all kinds of loopholes, all kinds of weird nonsense lying in the law. And then they play with those things.
Exactly. So when your family left Rhodesia, what year was it? When did you? What was going on in South Africa when you moved there?
I'll tell you. I actually put this in a video that I put out the other day, but let me go through it again. My father passed away in 1980, and I was 17 at the time. And my brother, who'd been in the army, he said to us, we should really get out of the country. And to be honest with you, we'd never even thought of coming to South Africa. All of this thinking happened within about a year. And my brother said, we just got to get out of here. It doesn't matter what. And no matter how it goes at the other end, and we have no prospects there, but we must get out of here. So the best plan that we could come up with was, at the time, South Africa had a short-term military contract by which they would employ Rhodesian soldiers. And although I was just 17, I went and I applied for this short-term military contract. And I was interviewed in Rhodesia. There was a Boer colonel. And my brother had said to me, try and see if you can get into the South African Air Force, because you might be able to learn some skills there that you can use. And when I spoke to this colonel, he suggested to me that because my Afrikaans was not that good, that I should actually try and get into the South African Navy, because the Navy was more English dominated. So I said to him, fine, if you think I'll fit in better there, then let's do that. And I joined the South African Navy. So I actually dropped out of school a year early, joined the South African Navy, and that's how I came to South Africa. So I was here in Pretoria, and then I went and did my basic training in Saldanha Bay. I ended up staying in the military for just over 2 years as I was trying to find my feet. And at a point, I was seconded to Naval HQ in Pretoria. And in my video, I did a video called How America Built UFOs. And it's a video about secrecy and military secrecy. And in there, I explained my low-level job, but I was carrying around secret and top-secret files and stuff. And I just give people a little bit of insight, along with other things, into how the military actually works. And so, yeah, that's how I got into South Africa. I stayed in the military for just over 2 years, and then I saw an opportunity to try and get into computers. And I went and I passed the aptitude tests, and then I left the military and I went and worked for a semi-government organization which runs the telephones of the post office. And that's how I got into computers, and I started making my way through life. But that is basically it. So when I arrived here just as the heat was starting to pick up in South Africa. So when I got here in 1981, things were still pretty quiet. The South Africans hadn't really felt the whole communist onslaught coming yet, but it came. And by 1982, I remember I was in Pretoria, and there was a point at which some terrorists were given a vehicle, a truck, which had a false bottom, and they put a 120 millimeter mortar in this thing. I can't remember if a 120 millimeter mortar can fire 12 kilometers or 20 kilometers. I think almost 20 kilometers, could be wrong. But this 120 millimeter mortar, they were driving around outside Pretoria and they were firing random shells at various places in Pretoria. And I remember one of those shells fell in Voortrekkerhoogte, where I was staying. It wasn't anywhere near me, but it's a pretty mean shell and it digs a crater in a road. And it took them a couple of weeks to catch the guys. But that was like the beginning of things hotting up. And from about 1983 onwards, things really started hotting up. But by then, I was really working in computers and doing my own thing.
And so what year did Mandela go to prison?
Mandela went to prison. He was in prison for 27 years. It was in the 60s.
Uh-huh.
I think it was in the early 60s. So they let him out of prison in about 1989, I think it was.
Okay, so you were there for that. Just trying to get the timeline straight.
Before then, I already knew there was trouble coming. And even when I arrived in South Africa, I knew enough, even at that age, thanks to my brother. In fact, my brother and I, in 1983, I remember he and I sat down one day and we had a long conversation. And he was saying to me, you know what, I think South Africa's going to go downhill. And I was telling him exactly the same thing. We both agreed that things were not looking good and that South Africa would go downhill. And later it did. But the main way in which it went downhill, South Africa's weakness lay in its politicians and its political system. The Boers were very penetrated by enemy spies, and they also had the Jews coming up to them right towards the end, just before the end of South Africa. All of a sudden, the Jews became very friendly with the Boers. And suddenly, and that makes me think a lot of the people in your country in the GOP and their sudden friendship and love fest with the Jews. Very similar. Just before South Africa totally looped the loop and went totally nuts, the Jews were starting to be very friendly and the government was starting to talk all liberal-like. And that, so suddenly the right-wing, the conservative Afrikaners suddenly had this insight into liberalism, and they thought liberalism was going to save them. And part of this was they kicked out President P.W. Botha. He was the last true Boer president, the last guy who was truly honest. And they kicked him out. It was a bloodless coup. It was Boer on Boer, and they got rid of him. And the next thing you knew, this guy, F.W. de Klerk, came in. And they told us, he's so right-wing, he's the most right-wing, and blah, blah, blah. Next thing you know, Mr. Right-wing, he's busy giving away the country.
Well, you know, that's really well, that's pretty fascinating that they tried to label him and set people up to think he was a true conservative when they knew they had their claws in him already. That's a fascinating strategy, don't you think?
Yes, it's a lot like I say with Margaret Thatcher. You thought this hardcore, tough woman, and the next thing, the very woman that we think might save Rhodesia ends up saying, bye-bye, there you go, and that's that, and just dumped us and left us for dead.
Wow.
And that's exactly, Rhodesians couldn't quite grasp this. You know, for years afterwards, they kept saying, I mean, I've got lots of Rhodesian books, and they were saying, wow, you know, Maggie Thatcher, and everybody's hopes, you know what happened in South Africa as in Rhodesia, right before the end, right before the very end, suddenly it looks like out of nowhere your hopes are going up. But actually it's a complete fraud. That's actually when the biggest switch comes in, and that's when you're completely taken, and you don't even know what hits you. And then years later, everyone's saying, but you know, do you remember that? And do you remember that? But the Jews are so fast, they take you, and then 5 years after the event, or 10 years after the event even, you say, wow, you know, that happened and that happened. How could we let that happen? and you discover all these things that you didn't know.
Well, you know,
There's so much that you don't know.
Exactly.
And you find out later.
Well, history, let me ask you this. You made a comment to me, and I think this is a good point to bring it up again, about how the Jews are able to close doors before whites ever know there was a door.
You know something? This is something I want to go and revisit as well. But I began to realize, to my horror, once I started looking at these Jews closely, I began to realize that the Jews are so far ahead of us, and these liberals are so far ahead of us, that they already knew we were the enemy before we knew we'd be the enemy. You know, when they defined that word racist, how many decades ago? And they said racist, 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 and they did the whole thing about racism, and they locked all the doors, you know, made sure that political correctness was firmly established and everything was ready to kick racists out of the system. We didn't even know we were gonna be the racists. And when they were saying the Nazis and what have you, I didn't know that I was going to become like a Nazi. In fact, I regard myself now as a Nazi because I see Nazism as the way forward. And you know, I'm thinking, wow, I'm a Nazi now. Oh God, I'm the enemy. But my Jewish friends knew it long before me. In fact, my Jewish friend, I think he was bemused at how stupid I was.
Oh, I'm sure.
You know what? Because he even said to me, you know what I did? I let my Jewish pal write on my website. I said to him, you know what, you want to write, you're a Jew, you want to write on African crisis? I'll let you write on African crisis. Give me a name, I'll put your pseudonym on there, you can write whatever you want. And I let my Jewish pal write on African crisis. And then he said to me that he'd been telling other Jews he's got this right-wing friend. And he called me right-wing. I regarded myself as conservative. He called me right-wing. And I think all the Jews were probably saying to him, well, you know, lie to him and do this and do that and mislead him here and push him there and so forth. And he was astounded that he was a Jew and he called me right-wing, and he was astounded that I didn't regard him as the enemy. You know,
yes.
I could kind of pick up that in the conversation. He's amazed that I'm so dumb that I don't know he is the enemy, but he knows I'm the enemy. And of course, he's not telling me.
Right.
So here I am trying to deal with the Jews. There's a video I did called "Teaching Whites About Jews." In that video, I tell you a whole bunch of stuff about why I dealt with the Jews, how I had a Jewish friend in Israel, all the dirty things I did, hoping that I could get in with the Jews because I was hoping to get money. And at the time I was thinking to myself, I need to find a way to get guns for my fellow South Africans because one day we're going to need guns. And I was schmoozing with the Jews, hoping that one day I could make a plan. And in the end, I didn't get money and I didn't get guns.
No, they're going to keep both of those things out of your hands as best they can.
Absolutely. They'll be giving it to the blacks. And so, yeah, you're right. You know, the Jews know we are the enemy before we know we're going to be the enemy. And they've already closed the doors. There's a guy that I'm busy doing a video about. And this is going to be very controversial. And I'm going to mention his name. His name is Alex Linder. And I met that guy on the internet this year. He's an American. And this Alex Linder, there's a lot of controversy around him. And most people say he's a Jew. But we'll get into the whole Alex Linder issue. But what I will tell you is that Alex Linder has this saying where he says, you go from being a boy to being a man the day when you realize there's no way out except through the Jews. That you think you can get out of this, but you can't go out except through the Jews. You have to take the Jews on. You can't get out of this.
Do you think that the Jews, I see them really speeding this up. Here in the U.S. and in Europe, to me,
They
South
are, eh?
Africa, South Africa and Rhodesia with just test markets for what they want to do. They're testing their product, and
I,
I know they're doing it, but they're speeding it up because they're worried that people like you and I and so many people online are really waking up to this, so they have to nail it down before any more of us wake up.
I think you are dead right on that. And I think the Jews, being opportunists, looked at Rhodesia and especially the Boers, and they saw the methods by which they could get whites down even faster and even quicker, and they're applying it to you. So I do believe that they are using exactly those same arguments. They're saying, well, if we do this and if we do that, we've got these whites. They won't be able to get out of this one at all. But exactly as you say, I do believe that they realize that the writing is on the wall, that there is a backlash coming, and they need to hurry this thing up as fast as they can.
Well,
And
now,
they
but
obviously will also want to get people to make mistakes. They'll want us to make mistakes in a hurry as well. But yeah, I'm with you.
and you said something that really encouraged me the other day, History.
Yeah.
You said that the white race is the only race that will fight when they're outnumbered and win.
Yes. 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 And we've done it many times. We've done it many times. That fighting against great odds. We've done it so many times. The only time in our history that we didn't perform well militarily was when the Mongols invaded Europe. But otherwise, at all other times, we actually did very, very well. And we have a history of fighting against great odds. For us to fight being outnumbered 3-1, 4-1, that's nothing. We've done that plenty. And we've done fights where we've been outnumbered by even greater amounts. In Rhodesia, the whites were outnumbered almost 20-1. And that was how few we were. We were down to about 5% of the population, and we were still fighting and doing pretty damn well. So yeah, we can put up a stiff fight. We're not easy to beat.
Well, they were easy to put to sleep, though.
But you know why? When I'll tell you what our thing is, and I'm starting to grasp also what Adolf Hitler was telling the Germans, is there is nothing wrong with the average person going to sleep, and I'll tell you why. Because we whites have a proper structure. We have a proper hierarchical structure in our society, which is completely normal, it's completely healthy, it's completely good. And what the Jews have managed to do, and they've been working at this for so long, is they found a way to ingratiate themselves with the people at the very top. And they actually always operate near the top. And pardon me, and they work with the people at the top. And they are so good at corrupting them. They are so good at taking people at the top and quietly distancing themselves from their own people and working on their minds. And I think the Jews have successfully worked on the minds of kings and worked on the minds of powerful people, and they have got this down to a T. And then once they've got control over the minds of the people at the top, then they turn the people at the top against the people at the bottom. So what happens to the white people is that basically the Jews destroy our leadership structure. And our leaders aren't bright enough or have various weaknesses that the Jews exploit. So I believe that our problem comes from treason at the top. That's what I believe. And I believe that you cannot fault the whites on the bottom for being asleep, because the whites on the bottom are always trying to work in line with what their leaders tell them to do. The problem occurs at the leadership level, and the Jews work on those levels. The Jews sit at those high levels. They're like an aristocracy and a corrupt aristocracy, but a very, very practiced skilled, corrupt aristocracy. And they've done this so many times. They've done it many times. The Jews have created trouble so many times. And remember, they've been thrown out 110 times. You want to tell me that they do a thing 110 times and they didn't learn some lessons from it? I don't think so. They learned a lot. 110 times. We are dealing with people who have been caught out 110 times. And they're just getting slicker every time. Because we don't destroy them, we don't get rid of them. We let them back in. That's our huge mistake. Our huge mistake is letting them back in.
Well, I see that in the Bible. So I can't wait to talk to your friend that knows the Bible the way I look at it. So I agree. Couldn't agree more. So here's something I want to ask you about, because I see this as being the linchpin that the Jews need to take over a country. And they publicize it in the Communist Manifesto. It's the second plank, I believe. A heavy and progressive income tax. Was Rhodesia robbed in taxes? I know South Africa was, and that's how they provided for the blacks and just created that just out of balance situation.
Income tax, I'm with you.
Mm-hmm.
I know that in America before income tax existed, that the average American paid about 2% in taxes, and then the Jews came along with income tax and the Fed. Mm-hmm. But in Rhodesia, we didn't really have a problem with income tax that I ever remember. Given that we had a war and all that, the whites weren't taxed that heavily, and the whites also weren't, the whites were so few, we didn't actually give to the blacks in the way that liberals can do. So in Rhodesia, we didn't really have a problem. Where the taxation came and was used very well was when Mugabe came to power. Because Mugabe brought a proper communist system into the country, and he had everything that the Soviet Union had, including political commissars. Can you believe political commissars existed in Zimbabwe? They appointed political commissars so that every farmer, every businessman had to deal with them, and then they basically found a way to grab hold of the economy. And for, I would say, about 15 to 20 years, for 15 years especially, they really milked the whites.
Well, instead of calling them commissars here in the U.S., we'd call them all the regulatory agencies. Same thing.
Well,
the bastardization of it, like the Bureau of Land Management, Department of Interior, all those things.
They have all these things that come in and start putting their fingers into your business. And they did very well. Mugabe, what is not so well known about Mugabe is that for the first 15 years of his rule, he spent most of his time engaged in warfare in other countries, either propping up other black communists or going on communist exploits. For example, Mugabe spent 11 years fighting in Mozambique to stop the blacks in Mozambique from knocking the communist government out. So they had 11 years of heavy fighting in Mozambique. Then when Mugabe won there, he then engaged in his greatest military expedition ever, was in an enormous war that took place in Central Africa in the Congo. And he fought there to such a degree that he broke the economy. This is actually how Mugabe ended up with taking the farms, because he engaged in so much warfare that the blacks in Zimbabwe couldn't handle it anymore. They were sending troops to other countries, and the troops were coming back in coffins. And this fighting went on for years. They had huge battles in the Congo. And it actually damaged and structurally broke the Zimbabwean economy by about mid-1995. And then what happened was that kicked off a movement where blacks and whites started. Now remember, most of the Rhodesians had left. About 2/3 of Rhodesians left in the time when I left, which was the early to mid-80s. About 1/3 of them remained on and tried to make a go of it. And it is those third who then struck a deal with the blacks. despite all the communist controls, this is actually a counter-revolution that took place. People don't realize this. But this counter-revolution started with rich whites who were aligning themselves with the blacks at the lower levels. And they decided to form a political party, and they formed a thing called the MDC. And that MDC came into being in 1995, and it slowly grew and grew. The whites and blacks were working together. The whites were using their money and resources to help the blacks. And this thing started gaining momentum. And it came to Mugabe's attention in the year 2000 because he wanted to change the constitution, and he was starting to think of seizing the farms. And the next thing he realized was the blacks actually rejected a referendum. And when the blacks rejected this referendum, Mugabe couldn't believe it because he had complete control. And then he realized the whites were behind it. And then he realized the white farmers were behind it. And that's when he started the land invasions. He started seizing the farms because he realized that the whites there were actually doing a kind of a Jewish trick, believe it or not.
Oh, and really?
Yes, can you believe it? It was like a Jewish trick that the rich sponsored the poor, and the two worked hand in hand, and this thing was actually working. They actually had the beginnings of like a little black revolution, but Mugabe came with the army, and he was very fast, and he knocked this thing out. And in the end, he had to destroy most of the farms because they nearly beat him. They nearly beat him. It wasn't the normal kind of thing that whites do, but it was actually a sort of a type of a Jewish trick. It's a typical Jewish revolutionary strategy. And these whites in Zimbabwe pulled it off. In the end, they paid for it because they lost everything. They lost their farms, they lost their businesses. Most of them had to leave. And probably about 2/3 or more of the whites who were still there had to leave. They ran away.
And many of them lost their lives.
Yes, and probably more were killed in that counter-revolution than died in the original war. Probably. Yeah, it was very nasty. But it's a thing that I want to go and revisit because lots of people don't realize that that was actually the second white rebellion against the blacks. And now, of course, it's totally broken. The blacks are broken. The whites are broken. All opposition to Mugabe is defeated.
But here's the most ridiculous part was Zimbabwe dollars are the laughing stock of the currency world.
Actually, they don't exist anymore.
Yeah, but yet I hear that Zimbabwe is refusing to accept the rand.
No. The last I heard was that the Zimbabwe dollar doesn't exist, and they use American dollars, yes, American dollars and South African rands. That is used as currency in Zimbabwe. They don't use Zimbabwe dollars.
That's interesting. Well, they were done.
It went so bad that eventually it meant nothing. It became worse. It became worse than the collapse of the Germans. You know, the Weimar Republic. It went worse than that. But here is one teeny weeny bit of good news out of it. The good news is that when Mugabe fought the blacks and the whites in this counter-revolution, that completely shattered the economy, completely shattered it. So yes, the whites may have walked out and the whites are mostly broken in everything, but he's sitting in a country with about 90% unemployment and there's nothing going on. The country, the only way he survives is they managed to discover diamonds, and he has all sorts of other deals going on, probably with the Jews and the Chinese.
Yeah, well, he hasn't missed a meal. I mean, he's a gajillionaire.
Himself, he's quite fine. But the country is absolutely damaged beyond repair. And to me, that's good news. To me, it's good news. Yeah. I'm happy with that he didn't walk away with everything intact.
Yeah,
this thing is shattered.
Good. Yeah.
And he had to kill a lot of blacks. He had to. And more than at least half of his population also does not live inside Zimbabwe. Most of them live in South Africa and in other bordering nations. So the other good thing is that he lost all his mass support that he had. The only way he remains in power is through absolute dictatorship and total control. So he's completely unpopular even with the blacks. So at least everything is ruined for him, and that for me is the good thing that came out of it. that he's shattered, and everything is shattered, and they are living on the bones of their asses. The super rich in Zimbabwe are living very well, but the majority of the country is in utter ruin.
Yeah, 90% unemployment. I mean, I can't even imagine. We have 10% here, and everybody's belly aching. I mean, so
people don't know what unemployment is until you get to Africa. Here in South Africa, I wouldn't be surprised if unemployment is 70%, even more, easy.
Yes,
easy.
Well, there's something.
The blacks lost enormous numbers of jobs. The blacks have lost far more jobs than the whites, although the whites have taken a hell of a beating too, I might.
Yes, but the blacks can get assistance. They're still able to get welfare and things like that the whites aren't able to get.
Correct.
That's damaging.
Although at the end of the day, things are breaking down more and more, and there's a limit to how much you can do. There is talk that maybe the South African economy is heading to where Zimbabwe's economy was in 1995. Maybe we are at that point where the economy is actually either starting to break or has broken somewhat, and it's going to break,
Yeah, well, it has to. There hasn't been a fiat currency in history that hasn't gone to the fiat currency graveyard. So it has to happen, and I'm expecting it with dollars, and they've been kicking this can down the road for a while. But before we wrap up today, one last thing that I'd really like to hear from you on, because the video that you made about this really explained it to me, because I've always seen the Jews, the Vatican, and the Freemasons as being interconnected, but I could never knew the whole history of it. Because there are people that'll argue, oh, it's the Jews, it's the Jews, it's the Jews, and then people say, oh no, it's the Vatican. Then it's the Freemasons. Tell us about that.
How does it fit together?
Yeah, how does it fit together?
My view is that there are a lot of conspiracies. Even in Germany before Adolf Hitler, there was something like 800 secret societies. So secret societies are quite a normal part of many countries. People are engaging in conspiracies. But I regard some of these conspiracies as being like amateurs and kindergarten compared to the Jews. The Jews are the ultimate conspiracy. They are the best conspirators of all. And what I suspect is that the Jews began a process of infiltrating other conspiracies, and the Jews took over other conspiracies. And that is, so when you hear Freemasons, the Freemasons, I suspect, are ultimately have their strings pulled by the Jews. Now, the Vatican and the Catholics, that has happened in quite a easy to understand way. There was a guy called, I think his name is Piper Collins.
Yes, Michael Piper. He just died recently.
Yes, he didn't die long ago. Now, he did an excellent book called The Judas Goats. And I put an interview of his online. I think it's a 2-hour interview. And I listened to this interview, and I was so impressed with him. Of all the Christians I've ever heard talk about this kind of stuff, you can see this guy was a Catholic, and he knew Catholicism inside out. And he could see when these Jews were making moves, and he had the published evidence, because the Jews were boasting about it as well. So there was a Jewish magazine that was boasting that they had spies in the Vatican. And so the Jews later on had to try and cover up after their boasting. So this Piper Collins guy, Michael Piper Collins, he went and he wrote a whole book, and he did an excellent radio interview where he explained it in great detail. How they not only got spies into the Vatican, they then got the church to change itself. Vatican II is insane, because Vatican II happened in the early 60s, and in Vatican II, the Roman Catholics actually said that the Jews are not responsible for the death of Jesus.
I remember that. I was in grade school. I was in grade school when that happened.
Well, I didn't know it until recently, and they reversed 2,000 years of teachings. They turned it on its head. And then Michael Piper Collins also explained in detail how the Jews actually censor the Catholic Church. The Jews later went and they worked on all of the bishops, and the Jews have a whole system whereby anything the Catholic Church publishes goes to the Jews first, and then the Jews decide what they don't like, and then they tell the bishops. That they have got the whole Catholic Church sewn up, hook, line, and sinker. And you can see, I did another video called Jews 104, Secret Jews. And in there I analyzed Pope Francis. And I've got to tell you, this guy must be he's a Jew, man. Oh. He's a secret flipping Jew, this guy.
Wait a minute. You see the Pope with his little yarmulke on, or his Dagon the fish god mitre?
Yes.
And we don't see the Judaism in that? I mean, really, Catholicism is just an ancient mystery Babylon religion with a very fine coat of Christianity put on it. And unfortunately, I believe that all the seminaries and Christian Bible schools and that, they've been infected by this same infiltration.
Absolutely. Christianity has been really badly infiltrated. But I think that currently the Jews control the Vatican and the Catholic Church hook, line, and sinker. There's not a part of it they don't control. They run this show from top to bottom. There's not a thing that happens there that they don't utterly control. And this is the same Catholic Church that 500 years ago was busy driving the Jews out of Spain and busy hunting for Jews via the Inquisition, doing an excellent job. And now that same church defeated by the Jews. Defeated and totally taken over. So I think you'll find that the Jews have taken over everything that's secret, and all these other little conspiracies are just small fry for the Jews, because nobody knows conspiracy, corruption, and all that kind of game like the Jews.
Well, they like to keep the confusion going.
They've been doing it too long.
They like keeping the confusion going and everybody arguing, and that's why they always point, oh, he's an agent, no, he's an agent, point fingers at each other. They just like to keep this whole thing going, to keep us distracted from who the real enemy is.
You know, Alex Linder says American politics is a Jewish funhouse. And that's exactly exactly that, man. It's a funhouse. You think I can vote for the guy on the left or the guy on the right, and as you yourself have said, they all belong to the Jews, and the Jews make sure that anybody who rises, they're in on the act.
Oh, exactly. And that's great. I always say that Washington is a suburb of Tel Aviv.
Actually, I must tell you a little Zimbabwe joke. We have a similar thing. I like that. That's excellent. And the Zimbabweans tend to have a bit of a wry sense of humor. And the distance between Harare, the capital, and South Africa is about 1,000 kilometers. But the Zimbabweans refer to Johannesburg as Harare South, and so they regard us as a suburb of Harare, even though we're 1,000 k's away, because there's so many flipping Zimbabweans here. So
yeah, that was funny. There was a cartoon, a political cartoon, and the word of the day was apartheid. And then the professor says, well, what's the capital of South Africa? And a student raises his hand and says, Tel Aviv.
I like that.
Yeah, they're good. Yeah. I can't believe we got to wrap this up soon. It's bothering me. We've got so much more to talk about here. History. I just so appreciate you joining me today, and being able to pre-record this, because it's late in South Africa and early here. You'd be up till 3 a.m. if you wanted to talk to me live on the show. But let's talk about South Africa today, and there's a very interesting figure that has a lot of people, South Africans everywhere, worried. And his name is Julius Malema, and I like that somebody has nicknamed him Kitty Amin.
Yes.
He is following in Mugabe's footsteps, don't you think?
Absolutely. Julius Malema is actually from the ANC Youth League, and he discovered the truth about Nelson Mandela. He discovered that, unlike what the Jews tell you, that Nelson Mandela was a hardcore, violent communist who wanted to murder people, because that is indeed what Nelson Mandela was. And there was a book that came out in recent years. I think it was written by someone in England, I think. It's called Young Mandela. And if you go and have a look at Young Mandela, it's one of the few books about Mandela that basically tells the truth. And they come out and they show you what a radical commie young Mandela was. And that is exactly what he was. Exactly what the Boers said he was in the 1960s is exactly what he was. And this Julius Malema discovered that indeed Nelson Mandela is this radical commie, and he then also decided that he must continue with the work of Nelson Mandela. And he tells people that he's true to Mandela, which is actually true. Mandela was a violent communist.
Yeah, but bombs and guns, sure.
And so this Malema gained a lot of power among the blacks, especially the poor blacks, because, you know, this is where the game gets interesting. When the ANC came to power, it was radical, and there was a communist plan for a two-step takeover of South Africa. I used to document this on African Crisis, and I even had the various excerpts from a book called Talking to the ANC that the South African government published before we handed over power. Now, in there, the communist plan for taking over South Africa was, first you need to get political power. But once you get political power, the war is not over. The second step is to seize economic power. Because communism is a Jewish idea and it's about complete power. So once you have total political power, you then go after the money. You go after everybody's assets. You go after all the big business that's not in your camp. So you go after that whole thing. And it is my view that the Americans and the Europeans put a lot of pressure on the ANC not to go as radical as they wanted to go. And there's a whole bunch of stories around that, because it also has to do with the fact that one of our black presidents was kicked out by another black president who wanted to become radical. And even he had to stop as well. So we've had blacks who've tried to go radical after Mandela, and they can't quite get it right because of other arm twisting from the Western world. But it's all very quiet, hush-hush. So the blacks, believe it or not, are keen to have everything stolen from the whites. The average black believes it and wants it.
Yes, and they've been told that they deserve it because the whites oppressed them.
Exactly. So the irony, the bizarre irony of South Africa is that these black politicians whose job it is to steal our stuff, they are themselves arm wrestled by the West, who make all kinds of quiet threats to them if they don't go along with globalism. So they do sneaky things, but they can't do all the sneaky things they want to do. Now, the blacks underneath them, the low-level blacks who voted for them, they are actually waiting in great anticipation for the government to come and take everything from us. And you can't believe how disgusted the common blacks are that their government can't destroy the whites. And it's actually a point of, it's created a whole sort of civil war type of situation among the blacks now, because they're saying, you know, why can't we just steal the farms? Why can't we just take all the businesses?
You know, it's so funny. It's so funny that the Jews are doing this and instigating all this because they really hate the blacks too. They really only love the people. So they're just setting it up to starve the blacks. They're just setting up another famine to get rid of them. If you kill all the white farmers, we know what the black farmers can do. Nothing. And so in your country anyway. And so they're just setting it up that the blacks are going to kill themselves.
The Jews just use blacks for cannon fodder everywhere on earth.
Yeah.
They see the blacks as dummies and they just lead them into everything that'll work for the Jews. Because the blacks don't see what the game is. You think the whites don't see the game, the blacks are even dumber. And so this guy Malema actually rose to, he got himself a huge following of common blacks because he was starting to bring out the original agenda of the commies, which is to turn the country into a full-blown communist state like Mugabe has done. And he's actually been going to visit Mugabe. Mugabe said wonderful things about him. He said wonderful things about Mugabe. Those of us who are Rhodesians, we have strongly suspected for a number of years that they have been trying to instigate a race war, that Malema, with the aid of Mugabe, is trying to create a race war in this country. And that's a whole complicated subject that we don't have time to go into. But Malema's been trying to revive this leftist thing and go the communist route full ball, seize the whole country, drive the whites out. He thinks it can be done. And he's got a hell of a lot of black support for that. A lot of black support. So now we have a very bizarre situation where the current government is actually somewhat against him, but not fully against him. And they have this whole dynamic that goes on between them, as the one sort of helps the other one, and the one is sort of sympathetic to the other one, but they can't also do what they really want to do, which is just get down and murder and steal and do the whole thing. But
yeah, and the hilarious part to me is Mr. Malema was in the UK just last week or so, and he didn't seem to hate his handlers there.
Yes, I believe he's trying to
invent himself,
recreate the same old leftist communist junk in England. And I believe that the far left and the stupid liberals in Jew-infested England are actually falling for his lines. You know, the English are beyond redemption. The only people I have hope for in England are what few Nazis and fascists there are, because most of England is totally hopeless.
Well, the BNP, the British National Party, has been completely infiltrated by Jews. So I don't have any hope for them either.
They won't go anywhere. The one in England that I'm quite interested in is a group called the New Dawn Party. I've had a lot of chats with them. They are the only people in England that will stand up and call a Jew a Jew. I've had a good bunch of chats with them.
Good for them.
I like them.
Listen, we're running out of time here, and before we go, I'd very much like you to say, what can America and Europe learn from South Africa?
There are a lot of things you can learn, especially with regard to racial issues and how the race card is played. And I also think that even you people shouldn't lose hope, even if you become outnumbered. I still think that there's a lot of stuff you can pick up from our history. The more you can study our history, the more you can learn, because clearly the same agenda that was used on us is being used openly against all of you. And I think that there is much that we can exchange views on. I've learned a lot from you people about the Jews, and what the Jews have been doing in Europe and what they're doing in America. And I'm finding with my white nationalist friends that we have a much nicer vibe going, because now we are finding that we each saw different parts of the same thing. We all had a chance to experience some part of Jewish communist globalism, New World Order, and now we are finding that we're able to complete the picture of the puzzle together.
Right, it's like the blind men examining the elephant. One's describing the nose, the other one's describing the tail, the other
that's brilliant. Brilliant. That is an exact example, and the internet's allowing us to do this, and it's giving us an opportunity to do something that I don't think the Jews saw coming. That is the good news. I think we've got some good opportunities. But I do believe, one final thing, my only message to Americans and Europeans is, nobody's going to come and save you from the top. It's got to come from the common white man, because the whole top is corrupt, and only common whites on the bottom can really drive the agenda. And you're going to have to find leaders and say to those leaders, either you do what we ask you to do, or we're going to have to lynch you. Because if you don't do that, we'll get rid of you and we'll get another guy. Because that is the only way forward. That's the only way the Germans and the Italians did it. And there's a question you asked me, can the Jews be defeated politically? The only guy who defeated the Jews politically was Adolf Hitler.
Yeah, and that's why they like to keep this anti-Hitler thing going all the time.
They hate it.
They don't want anyone to take a page out of that book. They want to make sure you never open the book, much less take a page out of it.
Absolutely, because the Nazis were the only people who systematically outmaneuvered the Jews time and time again. And the only reason they lost was because America entered the war. Otherwise, they would have won.
Right. Well, and I also think that Hitler's allegiance, he was too good-hearted to Mussolini. He should have ignored Mussolini and let that happen there and taken Moscow when he had the chance.
And one thing about Mussolini was not against the Jews.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, interesting.
Mussolini was not against the Jews, and I am sure that that was part of how his thing came to be a mess, and why Hitler then had to help him out of his messes. That was the key thing.
History Review channel, we must do this more often. I've been so delighted. I love your channel. Every one of your videos is like potato chips to me. I've gone through half a bag already, and I can do the other half.
That's excellent.
I just love your videos, and hopefully we'll add this interview to them as well.